You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, thank you so much for being part of our show. We hope you like what we're doing here. Make sure you guys follow us on all of our social media sites, Facebook at Hazard Ground Podcast. We're on Instagram at Hazard Ground Podcast and on Twitter at Hazard Ground. And this week's guest, once again, steps us outside the realm of our normal kind of guests where we get a military member to tell their story. We're stepping outside those bounds and actually getting a freelance photographer who has covered the Iraq and Afghanistan wars through the eyes of a camera lens. His name is Peter van Agtmael, and again, he's a freelance photographer, primarily working now with the New York Times, Time Magazine, and the New Yorker, where you can find most of his work. He also has his own personal website, and he joins us now on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Peter, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
We start this podcast by asking how people got into the military. Since you're not in the military, we'll ask you, how did you get into photography? Because it's not something that a lot of people venture into.
Yeah, well, in a way, those things are probably intertwined. When I was a kid, you know, like most kids of my generation, I'm 36 now. I had a grandfather that served in the Army in World War II, and was in Europe from just after D-Day till the close of the war. And he and I were always very close. And his military service was a huge part of his identity. And from an early age, he kind of steeped me in the stories of what he'd experienced over there. And it mostly was kind of, frankly, the brighter side of it, you know, the camaraderie and the pride and the adventure and things like that. Not so much about the brutality and the violence and the sadness of it. But it sunk its teeth into me somehow that I always. And from an early age, I developed a strong interest in World War II, and then expanding beyond that into sort of the history of conflict, especially America's history of conflict. But I can't say I was ever temperamentally suited, particularly for joining the military. So it wasn't something I really strongly considered. But when September 11th happened, and then the invasion of Iraq, I was in university, and I had an interest in photography at that point, and an interest in journalism, and kind of the wars of my generation, of our generation, really were intersecting with that interest in photography and journalism. So in my early 20s, I kind of resolved to start covering those conflicts, and began really in January 2006, and continuing to this day. I mean, I was last in Mosul just a couple months ago.
Wow, interesting. So when you begin your photography career, were you always intending to shoot military style stuff? I mean, or how did you develop your photography style, I should say?
Well, it was sort of a combination of things. Definitely covering the conflicts was something that was important to me from the very beginning. But simultaneously, I was studying history at Yale, and Yale has a very strong art school. And so I was taking that interest in photography into the art department, and they and through the art school there, it showed me kind of a broader vision of looking at the world around me, not so narrowly focused on kind of the sort of oftentimes kind of two-dimensional emotions that war photography often has, which generally tends to focus on just the violence and kind of the horror of it, but the school there kind of focused on looking at photography, really holistically, looking at on kind of every term of emotion and beauty, and how all those things kind of complement one another and in many ways contradict one another. So those were lessons well learned when I ended up in Iraq in 2006, because war was far more complex than kind of the vision that I'd largely been seeing up until that point. And
did you ask to go to Iraq in 2006? Like, did you ask, or you went on your own, or how did you end up there?
Yeah, when I was 24, and I'd only really been working as a photographer professionally for about a year, so I didn't have any clients that would send me there. They're generally, magazines are wary about kind of giving really kids without any experience their start in a situation like that. They just don't want to take responsibility for it. So I had a strong kind of passion for going, and I'd spent the previous few years trying to kind of work my way up to it. I don't have military training, but you have the training of journalism, which you can kind of steadily test your limits and your kind of threshold for fear and uncertainty with the real world. So I tried to do that really kind of methodically in the years after I graduated college, and at some point I just felt prepared, and I sent an email to a public affairs officer in Iraq, in CPIC, and about a week later, I had approval to join a unit up in Mosul. So I went in there in January 2006 and spent 2 months with 172nd Stryker Brigade.
I was there actually at the same time. So when you contacted Army Public Affairs and they got back to you, did they pay for your flight over there? You had to pay out of pocket.
Well, I had to pay for the flight to Kuwait, which was about $1,000 round trip. But then they flew me out there.
Sure, yeah, okay.
I was in Ali Al Salim, that big tent city.
Yep.
And then they flew me out there. And then I just when you're embedded, I don't know if you had embedded photographers or journalists with you. You're staying with the unit, and so you're just eating at the DFAC and going along with them on patrols and missions. And so for 2 months, really my only expense was cigarettes, really.
Yeah, well, and so tell me about that experience from your standpoint. I mean, what were your preconceived thoughts and expectations going into being with the unit day in and day out, and how much contact did you expect to see? I mean, give me kind of the rundown of what you thought going in, and then what actually happened.
I tried to prepare myself so thoroughly and kind of unsentimentally almost as to what I was going to experience. I'd steep myself in both what had been written about the war in long form and short form in the previous years, the photography that had been done about the war, the photography that had specifically been done on embeds in that particular area of operations. And so, I had a surface view that I thought was pretty accurate. But at the same time, you never know who you're going to be and how you're going to act when you're confronted with it, in reality. And of course, what I started seeing for myself had things in common with what I think other journalists and photographers had seen. But I tried to really be as open as possible and not have any preconceptions and see it, with the uniqueness of the individual experience, which hopefully I did. I mean, unfortunately, when you're young, at least when I was young, it's easy to be, not a slave to tradition, but beholden to tradition and what you think is the expectations of the media. And it took some time to kind of unwind those lessons a little bit too. Many of them were valuable ones about how to kind of conduct myself and how to look and what to say. But in the end, it was a very personal journey too.
So the first time you are out with a unit and you get into contact with an enemy, what were your thoughts and feelings, and how do you clear those out to actually do the job that you have to do?
Well, I think, maybe this has some overlap with what it is to go through training as a soldier. At a certain point, as a photographer, you have a job to do out there too. And that job is part technical and it's part, emotional and it's part intellectual in a way, but it relies on the precision that you're so mindful of your surroundings and every second and how each second alters the scene you may be seeing that, there wasn't too much time to think about what it was that I was experiencing. The animal instinct take over to, primarily make sure that I was trying to be as safe as possible under the circumstances and not endanger anyone I was with, of course. And then secondarily to take pictures that kind of powerfully represented the scenes that I was seeing. And so between those two things, there was not a lot of time for kind of fear or trepidation, fortunately, with me always, I've always felt in a weird way very comfortable operating in conflict areas because you have to be so focused, and it's the fear kind of kicks in after I get back when I kind of reflect on what I saw in the pictures and in my memories.
I know you mentioned that, the part of the war that's easy to photograph is all the destruction and all the death and everything else, and there is another side to that often doesn't get told. When you think back on your experience in doing war photography, Did you come across anything that you thought, was, look, this is a moment or whatever that I don't need to photograph, or this just kind of needs to be where it is and it doesn't need to be captured on camera?
Not too much. There were a few times I didn't take pictures, partly because I was sometimes so surprised or shocked that it took a minute to register that I should be taking pictures. But generally, I've tried not to ever censor myself, but not to be casual about what I put out into the world either. To really spend a lot of time with the work afterwards, reflecting on it. And generally, I'm working for weekly magazines whose deadlines are oftentimes weeks or even months after I take the pictures. So I'm allowed that kind of space for reflection, and the editors I work with are very open to a dialogue about what is appropriate for my experience in representing the subject. I take my responsibilities as a journalist seriously. I don't want to sensationalize for the sake of melodrama. I want it to be something that is unsparing, but also, that a lot of points of reference can find relatable and sincere to their own experiences. So, and that's a hard balance, of course, to find, between, what one's personal truth is and what a more objective truth might be. That's a constant struggle and a constant thought process over the years.
No, I certainly understand where you're going with that. Some of the moments you said where you were surprised or shocked, can you talk about those experiences? What sticks out to you about them that you remember that says, well, oh my God, I should be taking pictures of this? And
the two ones I remember the most were both from from the first embed I did, where I was really still learning the ropes in a lot of ways and trying to figure out, what my own perspective really was. And I remember the first one was this time when a chaplain, the chaplain from the unit came out on patrol, and we were passing through a graveyard, and he took a piss in the graveyard in full view of a lot of the Iraqis, and then kind of made a glib remark afterwards and called it this holy piss, and I could just. And I was, frankly, a little shocked and outraged that someone who was kind of a religious figure, representing the military and representing, Christianity was urinating in a graveyard in full view of people. So, but I was so surprised at the time somehow I just didn't photograph it. And I wish I had afterwards because it was a powerful moment. Of course, it's also a moment that, could be easily misused, powerful to document, probably powerful and a powerfully resonant scene, and in some ways a symbol of some of the miscalculations of this conflict, but at the same time could easily be used as propaganda. So it's one of those things where I regret not taking it, and at the same time maybe feel a little bit of relief. And the other one was kind of a similar situation where it was, this is what the photographer sees, and I'm sure it might be interesting for you or your military listeners from the other side. There was a moment where a young Iraqi policeman who was off duty had been shot in the middle of the street, and I was with the unit. We found his body right after it happened. We'd heard the shots, found his body on the street. His parents were coming out there, and at the moment discovering his body and grieving over it. I mean, it was a terrible scene, and the soldiers I was with were very upset about it. And they were just kind of grabbing anybody in sight that was a young man and roughing them up pretty aggressively. And at the time, I didn't photograph it because I was also sort of outraged by this cold-blooded assassination and sympathetic, to the soldiers I was with. So I restrained myself from photographing those scenes, again, fearing if they were taken out of context, they could be misused. And now, again, I don't know what I would do with those pictures. I have many more scenes like it, but I would certainly try and take the photographs and then sort it out later. That's generally my attitude, that, I almost don't, I trust my thoughts on reflection. I don't always trust my instincts at the time. So I just try and push myself to instinctually respond first and ask the questions later.
I mean, I think anybody listening to this podcast who has any knowledge of the Iraq War, with those two instances you discussed, had those photographs been released, it would have been extremely damaging, not only to the individuals, but to the Army and the mission and everything as a whole. And discretion being the better part of valor, obviously it didn't work out that you didn't snap those photos, but when you hear those stories, it's part of me is disheartened because we had people who acted that way, and they're fellow people who put on a uniform like me that should hold themselves in a higher regard and did not, and are supposed to make better decisions in those moments and did not. But in the same respect, if some of the photographs, obviously, we go back to reference Abu Ghraib and everything that happened there, if those photographs don't come to light, the power of those images obviously changes things. So when you think back and you reflect on that, and as you kind of touched on it a little bit, the effect that they could have, what is your feeling on kind of your ability or a photographer's ability to have affected the war in general and foreign policy and how we react and everything else?
Yeah, I mean, this is the really complicated $1 million question. I just am wrapping up watching the Ken Burns Vietnam War series. I don't know if you've been watching
Yes.
it, but which is a extremely interesting, powerful experience to me. Photography plays a prominent role in that. Photography, in many ways, played a prominent role in that conflict and altering perceptions of the conflict. But what the narrative is within photography is pictures like, from the Tet Offensive, the execution of the Viet Cong member and the young girl who'd been burned by napalm running down the road, both of which won Pulitzer Prizes. Those are seen as altering perceptions towards the war. In many ways, my feeling is they just kind of became symbols of the war at that point. There are many other powerful pictures, even more powerful than those, taken at different times that resonated in different ways. What's interesting about the Iraq War and the Afghan War is, you mentioned Abu Ghraib, is that actually in a lot of ways the most resonant pictures were not taken by professional photojournalists,
Right, yeah.
but taken by the soldiers themselves and ended up being leaked to the press. And I always found that interesting because the role of photography in society also changes over time. And I have a head full of iconic images taken by my colleagues, but they don't have that kind of popular recognition in the same way. So, but this is all to say that photography, plays a complex role, and it's important to try and be really thoughtful and responsible about it. But you also never quite know what's going to happen and how people are going to respond. I mean, that's the mystery almost of the public and the flow of these wars and the shape they've taken over the years. And so you can be responsible, but it's also a leap of faith.
You mentioned about some of the photographs you missed that stick out. What are the photographs that you got that you can remember? Describe the photos and the circumstances around them. We'll give everybody a chance to go to your website and we'll tell them about it before we're done here. But some of those pictures may be up there. But I kind of want your perspective on some of the photos that you took that stand out to you.
Yeah, I mean, at different things at different times. I mean, I've been covering these conflicts at war, in the conflicts and at home now for almost 12 years, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, from the perspective of, and in the U.S. and in the countries surrounding these places. I mean, the kind of expanding concentric circles of these wars have been vast, and this moment in our history, also some pictures are embedded. I've worked a lot unembedded as well, so I've tried to look at this from many different angles. Most recently, I would say the most memorable picture I took was in April in Mosul, and it was for a story for the New York Times Magazine about the battle there. And I was at a hospital, and there was a man in his mid-50s who looked like he was about in his mid-70s. He came in with bandages over both his eyes, and he had a scan that revealed that he was never going to get his eyesight back. And he went out with his son afterwards, and he just sat down on this chair in the darkness with just a little bit of light kind of illuminating his face. And he just sat there with his hands and his beard kind of like, scratching deeply into his face, with these bandage covered eyes. And that was that was a very emotional moment. I spent a long time kind of watching it. And then I approached the son and kind of and the man and got their consent, and I just, that image has stuck with me for a long time. There are other things too. I mean, the earliest memory, if I think of the earliest memory that stuck with me, it was of watching a young American soldier succumb to burns. ID had hit his Bradley. He had burns over 90% of his body. His skin was coming off. It was mottled red and black, and I remember him calling out for his father over and over again, and the memory of that scene and of his voice, I couldn't. It took years till it wasn't at the top of my consciousness, And I don't, it's funny why some memories stick and others don't. I've seen a lot of people injured. I've seen a lot of people die at this point, and that one, for whatever reason, or these two stories, they resonate more than most. It's hard to say why. Sometimes even the pictures aren't the best pictures, but the memories imprint themselves real strongly.
I mean, you tell a fantastic story there, and the visual is, unfortunately, as jarring as that visual is, you certainly give it life, and I wonder, at what point for you is it too much for somebody who's not in that environment? Like, after years of doing this and multiple deployments and everything, I've just kind of learned that the nature of war is what it is. Even at that, there are times where even I have to turn away and go, this is too much. Like, I need a break mentally from all this stuff. But as a civilian who doesn't live in that environment every day, did you ever get to that point where you saw enough death and destruction, you saw enough depravity that you said, look, I just need to get away from this?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it comes in waves. This trip to Mosul was more of an exception rather than the rule. I'm not the same at 36 as I was when I was 24. I have a different threshold towards the risks I'm willing to take. I have less of a threshold for witnessing such horrible pain and suffering, frankly, and at the same time, this work has dominated my life for so long. As these things continue to say, okay, I'm done, and I want to turn I need to turn my back on this. It's very difficult for me to break away on something that's become really, in many ways, a defining characteristic of my life. So I'm trying to keep at it in more moderated terms and do a lot of other work and invest more in, friendships and relationships and family in a way I didn't when I was younger, and more hungry for, adventure and ambition and all these sort of, things that young men feel in a way that when you get a little older, you don't feel quite as much, or other things take priority. So, and including, going to therapy when it's needed, because sometimes when memories linger, it's, you got to find a way to talk them through and hope they start to diminish, because, I want to keep documenting what's happened for a long time. I mean, the story will go on for the rest of our lives in some form or another, and I want to, have the strength to keep doing it. So that means really moderating my emotions and being very aware of them too, and not trying to bury them.
When you look at your experience as a photographer overseas, how do you characterize it? Like, what stands out to you, and is there anything you regret about the job that you've done?
No, I mean, I don't have too many regrets. I mean, I don't think I've sat still enough for long enough to really let those regrets maybe bubble to the surface. I'm sure they're there. I just wouldn't able to be answered right now. If there's anything I sort of regret not starting with sooner, the first sort of 5 years I was doing this work, I focused almost exclusively on really the American perspective of these wars. And both in Iraq and Afghanistan, and at home too. I followed a lot of stories of veterans and their families at home. But when you're focusing in that, it's also missing, an important other part of the conflict, the critical other part of the conflict, which is the Iraqi and Afghan experience. And I didn't feel confident or well suited towards it before, and didn't really think much of it. But as I started to get into it and find myself very making friends with Iraqis and Afghans, and getting kind of steeped in Arab culture, and starting to also work as an educator out in the Middle East as well, teaching young Arab documentary photographers. I started to feel some regret that I didn't start in that process earlier to try and cover these conflicts on as many terms as possible from all sides. But that's really been the focus of my work for the last 5 years. So I've made up for it, I think. Although of course I also continue to photograph the American perspective on the wars, and even on this last trip to Mosul, did an embed with the 82nd Airborne who was out there.
Yeah, that's a real poignant thought, and it only reminds me of my experience during my first deployment. I can remember thinking towards the end about how many, because I was working with an Iraqi unit during my entire first deployment, training them and everything else, and I did this for over a year, day in and day out. I woke up and there was an Iraqi right to my left and right to my right, and an interpreter somewhere around, and I just remember thinking when I left the other side of this whole thing. I was so excited to go home, but I couldn't help but feel that I was leaving a big part of my life behind, and it was the people in Iraq that I was leaving behind. It was the bonds and the best word I can use is friendship with the people who fought alongside me, and some of those guys saved my life. I mean, I wouldn't even be sitting here talking to you without some of those soldiers that I trained who managed to save my life at one point. So. That is it's an incredible thought that I don't think we spend enough time in. And maybe it's because we're so, soldiers as military guys, we're so concerned with the job and the mission and the focus and the task and all that stuff. But I think that's, well said about the other side of this whole thing that we don't give a lot of credence to.
Yeah, a lot of innocent people have been killed, been injured, had their lives profoundly upended, and I fault the media a lot of the time for not giving that enough attention. I fault our politicians and for sometimes creating a dehumanizing atmosphere towards Arab and especially Muslim culture. I fault pop culture and Hollywood for kind of ignoring these stories as well. I mean, I find it deeply troubling because we have a very, I think, skewed perception in this country of who it is we're there to fight on behalf of, or at least, that's what we tell ourselves. And we've barely taken the time to understand what it is and who they are. And that bothers me. I mean, my partner, my romantic partner and sometimes professional partner is Syrian American. And so, whose whole life has been in many ways now defined by that conflict. And so, I have, the intimacy of friendship, the intimacy of love with that culture and have fallen in love with it myself. And it troubles me deeply more than anything, how ignorant we remain to it. And how it is having served with them, they probably was very different than what you would have expected in a lot of ways, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, they've surprised me at every turn. I do remember that. I mean, there are certain things that are dynamically different about Iraqis and Middle Eastern and Muslim cultures that'll never be like America. And that's not a bad thing. It's just flat out different. It's the only way to say it. But there are some things that I was certainly taken aback by, and the love and admiration and respect they gained from me was equal on the other end. And I think that just comes from being service members, and the bonds you share together and what you have to go through side by side every day just to stay alive. And that I think is something that never breaks and it never fails. And I feel that way about my American soldiers, but I also feel that way about the same Iraqi soldiers that I have memories of. And I'll never likely cross paths with those guys again, but that memory stays strong and that bond stays strong within me. I want to turn to a little bit of you mentioned ignorance, and what I found on your website, I thought, is probably the best word to use it because it's not pleasant, but you have a section on your website titled War Graffiti, and when I started flipping through it, I knew exactly what it was. And this is basically inner musings of soldiers in a porta potty. And this is where all this, for whatever reason, I've never understood this, but inside the porta potties that are all over these foreign countries where we were camped out doing our job, for some reason people take out a pen, a marker, whatever it is, and write down their thoughts and pictures and everything else. And let's just be honest about this, Peter, because you've seen it yourself and photographed it. Some of it's bile. It's disgusting. They're racial slurs, homosexual slurs. It's just it has no place in society, and people write it down on a porta potty wall for what I can't figure out. And one of them, actually, you take a picture of it. It's the title of your book, Second Tour, Hope I Don't Die, which is interesting. And I'm curious to know what sparked that, to give you that name. But kind of tell me a little bit about this war graffiti photography first.
Yeah, I mean that, that idea came about quite, literally like sitting there on the toilet and like looking around, and lo and behold, I was like, what's all this writing on the wall? And some of it was extremely interesting. I mean, it touched upon every level of kind of like, the selective kind of inner monologues of a huge variety of kind of personality types in and class and race in the military. And, the military is really a melting pot of society. So to me, it was very interesting to see how those kind of inner musings like interacted anonymously on the walls of these porta-johns and in some of the, the trailers and stuff. And so I just started, every time I was in a new base or in Kuwait at Al Yalsalim, just going into every stall and kind of obsessively photographing kind of everything I could find. That's actually a huge series of pictures, only a few on the website. It'll be a book one day because there's just so much, too much to be kind of captured on a website or as part of a book. And what was interesting to me now, if we look around the country and what's happened in the last few years, and we know that these questions of kind of race, especially, that had been largely kind of buried for a few decades following the civil rights movement, are now very much exposed again in society. And I hadn't realized that, and I've been aware of that for some time. And a lot of that started looking at these walls and reading some of that stuff. And I couldn't believe people were still thinking those things and writing those things. Well, sure enough, I was naive as hell and a product of my own class and my own upbringing in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., real kind of, enclave, liberal enclave in a lot of ways. But what that experience proved to me was how much deeper also I needed to dig and question my own kind of perceptions of what the world was and what America was, and think critically with what I was seeing, but also honestly and emotionally, hopefully, and also simultaneously do a deep dive into the history of this country from many spectrums. And I've always tried to, you can't separate yourself as an individual from beliefs in politics, but you can sure try and be thoughtful about understanding why people's beliefs exist as they do, as long as they're thoughtfully constructed. And that's what I try to do with this work. And to this day, I'm reading, I'm reading the New York Times every day, and I'm reading Fox News every day too, because I'm a curious person, and I feel a deep abiding kind of love for this country, and I feel deeply troubled by this country too. And you can never learn enough to try and understand it, and still you're often left with more questions than answers.
No, it's very well said, and I do want to talk about some of the pictures, because for those listening, they're probably wondering what we're talking about as far as what we see, and some of them have some lighthearted humor in it, and folks, we'll give you the website at the end, but we'll spare you the racist, sexist, homosexual kind of negativity and slurs that, look, it's out there, as you pointed out so well. Unfortunately, there are people who still think these things in America today, and I'd love to eradicate it all, but obviously it's not something that's going to happen anytime soon. So, the pictures on the website, you can go and see them yourself. But the reason is it's troubling to me that there are people who put on a uniform who are supposed to hold certain values, and they're not exhibiting those values by writing these things down. And so from that standpoint, it is very troubling to me. But just as an example, one photograph you have, it says, "All you need is love." Well, underneath it, somebody crossed out the word love and wrote heroin. That's kind of the way soldiers look at this thing. Then they get a little bit darker. Somebody wrote like a little poem that says, "The path is broken. I have lost the space, the essence that is so decidedly me. My soul is suspended in darkness. I am falling. I am lost." And it's just kind of, deep thoughts from individuals. And, two people commented on it. One said, "Kill yourself already." The other one says, "This man needs to get laid." That's just... It's funny how people react in combat. Another one says, "I shot an unarmed man in Afghanistan." Oops. Above a toilet paper roll, you have a picture of one that says "re-enlistment paper," LOL. You can kind of see some of the humor, as dark as it is there. But, just give me some of the background on those photos and what your reaction was to them.
Well, but it's also, I find it's complicated, my thoughts, because you can only wonder who these people are, because you'll never know. You can only kind of dream of what they might be thinking. When I read something like, "I shot an unarmed man in Afghanistan," oops, I wonder, why is that guy writing that on the wall? And is he really so glib about it? Or is this like something he's grappling with himself? And maybe it just happened. He's writing it on the wall to almost, try it on for size, how it feels to think that way. I mean, I know a lot of, I stay in close touch with a lot of folks I met over at Embeds and since then. And I know quite a few people who know they've killed, and a lot of them really grapple with those memories. And in fact, the folks I've met who in many ways have been most traumatized by their experiences, persistently traumatized by their experience, are the ones that have had to take someone's life. So, when I read that, I don't necessarily think, oh, this guy's some sort of like sociopath. I see someone who's probably in a lot of pain in a lot of ways too. People, and in the military especially, I know there's sometimes a culture of trying to take these things lightly or pretend like they don't mean as much as they do. But, we're all human beings, and we certainly have, the power to be violent and kill with some ease, but it doesn't come easy, or the memory of it sure doesn't come easy for most people, at least in my experience.
And then finally, the second tour, Hope I Don't Die, you found on a graffiti wall and named it after your book. What was the impetus for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of summed up partly to me just the fact that, a very small part of society was having a lot of burden placed on them and fighting these wars again and again. I mean, second tour, that was 2006 or whatever. I took that. I know people have done 3, 4, 5, 6 tours, sometimes even more. In the special forces, and I think there's a feeling, at least for me, also because I've been, to conflict zones, dozens of times at this point. There's this, feeling not of resignation almost. You're going. Sometimes you're ordered to do it. Sometimes you have to do it. For complicated reasons of your own, like as a journalist. Sometimes because you're assigned to do it, and sometimes because you just want to do it, and there's that fear and that trepidation going into it, and then some resignation too. So with that, when I read that, I saw sort of a bit of a reflection of what I was thinking myself at the time.
Obviously people can hear that you're on the streets of New York right now, so the noise in the background is justified from that standpoint. But when you go back to doing regular civilian photography that is not of a military war nature, do you find that it's easier, or what's different about it?
It depends on the subject matter. So the book you're talking about, Second Tour, Hope I Don't Die, was sort of the first book I did about these conflicts. And I did a second book called Disco Night, September 11th. Mm-hmm. That's the more comprehensive book in many ways. And then this year I just had a third book come out that called Buzzing at the Sill, which is looking really exclusively at America, kind of America in the shadow of these wars in many ways, and myself in the shadow of these wars, a bit more that are more primarily, trying to look at the conflicts in a historical, journalistic way. This one is looking historically, journalistically, but also, kind of personally as well, because there's only so much, as an individual having and processing these experiences that you can get out through the media, and books give the freedom to be kind of, express oneself, as fully as possible without constraint. But so that's the long answer to your question. I mean, within that, I see a lot of what I photograph is kind of interconnected, and my interest in these wars, has expanded over time, and kind of interest in America and American identity and American history more largely. So most of the assignments I try and go into, I try and accept, because I'm luckily in a privileged kind of professional situation at this point where I can turn down what I don't want to do, and I can pitch stuff that gets then picked up by magazines, and I'm trying to look at the society on kind of as holistically as possible, on as many terms as possible, to try and create a comprehensive body of work that really shows, who we've been and who we are and where we're going and what that all means. And these are big ideas and never can be fully answered, but, I have hopefully a lifetime of work ahead of me to at least give it a sporting try.
Any little picadillos or quirks that you can remember from your time based off of the individuals you serve with, Army versus Marines versus Navy versus Air Force? Any individuals in particular that you still keep in touch with and talk to and things of that nature?
Oh, I could probably only get in trouble trying to compare the services. So I'll pass. I'll probably pass on that one. In terms of individuals, though, a lot. I stay in touch with quite a few folks. I sometimes would embed with units for months at a time. So you build a bond inevitably. It can be a little lonely, frankly, being on your own as a photographer. Without your immediate colleagues around, and in a totally different kind of structure than you're accustomed to, but almost with every unit there'd be someone who I bonded with one reason or another, and most of them I stay in touch with to this day. A lot of them are actually in my books, and probably will continue to be, because part of my interest is in following these, the long tail of these wars over time, and that means decades. I wrote in my book that just came out, about growing up and this kind of handyman that was working in our house, who was a Vietnam veteran who'd been like utterly traumatized by his experience there. And he ended up, losing his mind and murdering someone and going to jail, and so, and he would babysit sometimes for me and my sister. He was a really sweet man and someone my parents liked a lot. And it was that early recognition of the kind of catastrophic violence in someone's mind that, who's physically unscathed but mentally kind of destroyed, that was something I was sensitized to, very, very young. I'm getting a little off topic here, but I mean, one more thing worth mentioning about, the folks I stay in touch with, it's a range. They're people that have just done tremendously well, and their experiences is serving in these conflicts kind of sharpen their ideas about the world and themselves, and they've gone on to amazing careers, and happy lives. And there are others who are very much stuck in their memories and stuck in their experiences, and there are quite a few who are somewhere in between, and so it's all that complexity that I'm trying to capture, that, PTSD doesn't mean just one thing, and serving in conflict doesn't mean just one thing. There are so many layers of emotions, and a lot of it is really about the individual and their experiences and who they were going into it, and the kind of help they had coming out of it, So, we like to simplify things in our culture, and most cultures, just easier to live that way maybe. But I don't think that serves the memory of these things very well. So I'm trying to deal with it in complex terms that are more true to my experiences.
No, but it's a reticent point from the stand. We talk about PTSD all the time on this podcast. I mean, it's a big part of a lot of the people that we talk to. It's a big part of their lives and how they get over it and how they deal with it and creating awareness about it. So from that standpoint, I respect your opinion. I wholeheartedly support it, because I guess where I'm going next is that when you look at some of the photos you've taken of people in their afterlife of combat, and whether it's missing a leg or a hand or burns or whatever, do you find sometimes that photographing them in that state is harder than it was in a combat environment?
Yeah, I mean, it can be, because combat and its immediate aftermath is so fast moving. You don't have that much time to think and contemplate. Looking at the scars of kind of war, both physically and internally in the long aftermath, that's a much more kind of contemplative process, and can be more emotional as a result, because it's also, it persists over so much time, for certain individuals. I have a friend who's, 11 years after he was injured, I wonder if he'll ever be able to get his life back on track again. It's painful to see that. And, in the beginning, when I first met him, I didn't have any of that skepticism, and neither did he. There was a lot of optimism about the future, and that seems to have disappeared over time. So, I think it's important to look at these things over a long period of time, and not just in the immediate aftermath of them happening, because it's too limited. I believe in the public service role of journalism in trying to tell deep and rich stories that resonate for history, and you can only do that by paying careful scrutiny over time, and constantly questioning yourself and your own motives and your own biases, and it's a difficult process, a painful one sometimes. There's a great responsibility with it as well. So, and I don't want to get it wrong.
No, and again, just salient point, and certainly an opinion I respect in the way you're doing it, because it means a lot that you put that much care and thought into it. I mean, it's easy to take a photo that could go viral and change the course of history or change the course of a lot of different things. I mean, we're recording this on October 4th. We are some almost 30 years removed now from Black Hawk Down happening, and the images of dead American soldiers being dragged through the streets in Somalia changed the way we do foreign policy forever. So it's easy to do that, and I think the fact that you put so much care into it is important, and it certainly is respectful of the work that we do as military members. Now, with that, there are two places people can find your photos. One, you have your own website, Peter Van Agtmael, and Agtmael is Agtmael. PeterVanAgtmael.net is the website where a lot of your photos are, and you can see Disco Night September 11th and War Graffiti. But then also MagnumPhotos.com is the other website of which you're a part of, and you kind of have to search for the newsroom to find it, correct?
Yeah, or you can go to the photographers link, and I'm on the drop-down page for the photographers. And,
there you go.
And if anyone's interested, I've done a lot of kind of long-form pieces for New York Times and New Yorker. If you just Google my names with those publications attached, most of that stuff's available free of charge. But I would say, if your listeners are interested in because the media always has its own spin on things. If they're interested in really the kind of purest distillation of the perspective I've been offering here, the best thing to do is those books, and they're available on Amazon and through my website. Ideally through my website, because the more the proceeds go to me, the Amazon takes a big cut. But I'm just happy to get the word out there any way I can.
Peter Van Agtmael, thank you so much for being part of the Hazard Ground podcast. Appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.